If you were looking to buy a Smart Fortwo 451, then you really need to see this, because there's way more to these cars than people realise. The 451 was the second generation Smart Fortwo, which ran from 2007 to 2014. Although it had a very similar silhouette to the 450 which it replaced, there were many differences, and it was very clear right off the bat that this was a much better built car and felt a whole lot more grown up. Still rear-mounted 3-cylinder units, the petrol engines went from the rather fragile and sometimes short-lived Mercedes-Benz units of 600 or 700cc to a far more substantial 1-litre unit from the Mitsubishi 3B2 family of engines. The 800cc diesel engine was carried over from the previous model. The 6-speed automated transmission in the 450 was often criticised for having a gear change so slow that you had to request your next gear in writing. This was improved upon considerably in this model with a new 5-speed gearbox, although it is still the subject of some criticism. Some people are just never happy. The Tridion, which is this structure here, usually in silver or black, was redesigned for better crash safety. And the removable plastic body panels felt a whole lot more substantial on these later cars. The length, width, height and wheelbase were slightly increased, so it is a slightly larger car, and it weighs a little bit more, between 750 and just under 800 kilograms depending on the model. Door handles became horizontal instead of vertical in the earlier cars. This improves the ergonomics. These cars now benefit from a removable bonnet section, which makes it far easier to check levels and replace bulbs. It fits neatly into 2 cutouts here, and it's even held by a strap so it doesn't fall to the ground. Certainly a lot easier than removing the 2 vents on the 450 and then reaching down through that tiny little hole and pulling your hand out with cuts and things. Towards the end of 2010 there was a mild facelift to this model, and you can tell these cars very easily because the badge here moved down into the grille. It was quite a big badge. At first I thought it looked a bit silly when they first came out, but we soon get used to these things and now they look fine. They have different bumper arrangements as well, different side skirts, and there are some interior differences. Facelifted cars had different vents, different radios, and for reasons I'm yet to understand, they did away with the temperature gauge. And while on the subject of the interior, the 451 did gain a kind of real car dashboard rather than the strange toy-like arrangement that the 450s had. It just feels a much more substantial place to be. Excluding the Brabus and limited edition models, which I won't be covering in this video, these cars were available in Pure, Pulse and Passion trim specs. Now the Pure was a very basic car. We're talking steel wheels, a solid roof and a semi-automatic automated gearbox. It also had a really cheap seat fabric that you could mark just by looking at it, and you often see used examples of these with seats with more stains than a tramp's trousers. It's not a good look. The door trims were very cheap on the Pure. They were all hard plastic. They didn't have these fabric inlays, and right here you had actual window winders as well, something you don't see. Didn't have electric windows like this. They were very basic cars, as I said, but less to go wrong. The Pulse was the sporty model. It had alloy wheels, a sport steering wheel with paddle shift, and a rev counter and clock in pods on the dashboard. The Passion was the luxury model, seen here in convertible form. Had it have been the ordinary hardtop version, it would have had a polycarbonate roof, much like this. They even had a blind you could pull forward, but it does reduce the headroom though. These cars also had something called soft touch, which is a fully automated transmission. It was a much nicer driving experience. Engines ranged from the 71 brake horsepower MHD, which stood for micro hybrid drive. This was essentially a stop-start system, and it wasn't without its problems. Some of the early 2007 and 2008 cars were available without the MHD. They're quite sought after cars. The next engine option was the 84 brake horsepower turbocharged unit. That's what I have in my car. I think that's the best to go for. There's also an 800cc diesel, which produces a whopping 54 brake horsepower, along with a lot of vibration. Think Massey Ferguson and you won't go far wrong. Now let's take a closer look at these cars. Starting with the bodywork, check the Tridion really carefully. This is the main structural part of the Smart. It forms almost a safety cage around you, so it's important that it's not damaged, it hasn't been repaired. It is normal for there to be some seams visible on it. It's not fabricated from one piece of steel, so you will see some joins. But check the overall condition and make sure it's not dented or full of filler. The chassis number on the Smart is here on the door shut. That sticker should be present. It gives you some codes on here which tell you the colours, EB2 and EAD, and those translate to silver Tridion and silver panels. So you can tell from these codes if the vehicle has ever been repainted or if it's ever had a panel change. These Tridions are far less rot prone than the 450, which used to have all manner of problems where they'd rust out in the wheel arches. But you can still get a bit of scabbiness at the back on the inner seals. These polycarbonate roofs can go opaque, it's quite common, and the vehicles that have a solid roof can delaminate. They have like a stippled finish that's then lacquered, and that can peel. It's all largely caused by UV, so unless you can find a car that's spent its entire life in the garage, you will find this on these vehicles now as they are getting old. These vehicles are also prone to windscreen seal failure. The bonding of the screen can leak, and that will let water into the car. It'll cause wet footwells, and it can let water into the SAM unit, which can be very costly. Water effectively trickles down here and can find its way under here into the electrical nerve centre known as the SAM. This little seal here on the tailgate, where the wiper spindle passes through the tailgate, can also cause a leak, and you can have issues with some cracks forming around the plastic part of the tailgate at the top, which can cause a leak into the vehicle. Over time, these door seals can compress, which can allow water to trickle in. Not too much of a problem on these, but it can happen. The locks on these vehicles are vastly improved from those on the 451, which had cables, and those cables used to sometimes get water in them and they would freeze. So you'd open the door and the door would stick, and you wouldn't be able to shut the door because the lock would freeze. Don't seem to have so many problems with these. The electrical part of these locks have been known to fail, and this usually means that you still hear the click, but the door doesn't actually lock or unlock with the rest of the car. And you do also have this little cap here that can be removed, so you can open this door with a key if you have some sort of electrical failure. That's a vast improvement over the 450, where the only place you could enter by key was on the tailgate. And as you can see, looking at that, it would be a very undignified entry into the car if you're anything other than a very small person. While we're in the area of the tailgate, these little lock tabs here that you pull to release, they can snap off, and you can reduce the chances of that happening by just pressing slightly against the tailgate when you release. It takes the tension off the lock. These are often missing on cars. Only the better spec models would have this blind. It's certainly a nice thing to have. If you're ever curious, under this carpet you can find the build date of your Smart. In this case, 10th of June 2008. For those who don't know about Smarts, the engine lives under this cover. You twist and you lift. Make sure this insulation isn't dangling down, can be a fire hazard. And there's more of it under here, and it can drop down. This is the 84 brake horsepower turbocharged unit in this car. Sometimes the cam cover gaskets can fail, and that can fill up the spark plug recesses with oil. Not too difficult a job. The engine front mounting can go on these cars, which causes a lot of engine movement, which you'll notice in the form of a judder or a shuddering when you pull away or when you change gear. That can also be a clutch problem, however, but it's often that mount. Notice the alternator on here. Well, the MHD models have a combined alternator and starter, and there have been some problems with the mounting of that combined alternator starter. Think Dynastart if you know old cars. They can throw the belt, which causes them to overheat. If you're interested about that, look it up, because that can be a problem, and it does put some people off buying an MHD car. I personally prefer this 84 brake horsepower version. Sometimes these intercooler fans can seize, which blows the fuse, which is shared by the air conditioning system. So if you've got a turbocharged model, that is a consideration, especially if your air conditioning isn't working. The sump can also crack when you try to remove the drain plug if it's been over tightened in the past or not removed for ages. Exhausts can also be quite rusty now. These cars are quite old after all. Later cars will have a flexi section that can deteriorate and disintegrate. Beware of some terrible aftermarket cheap exhaust systems that are only good for a year or two. If possible, it's always best to buy a second-hand, genuine exhaust for these cars. It's a far better proposition. Oxygen sensors in the exhaust can also burn out, which can bring an engine management light on. If you ever find that you've got a Smart that has a fuel smell, the first thing to check is the seal on the filler cap. That O-ring can crack, and when it does, it gives you a fuel odour. Technically it's a whole new cap from Smart, but I have found those O-rings on eBay. The clutches on these cars do not last forever, and the actuator can also fail. That needs to be adjusted both mechanically and also electronically as the clutch wears. It's something to consider. You can get gear selector faults on these cars, and the dreaded 3 lines on the dashboard is probably one of the worst. It can be a bit of a devil to diagnose. When driving these cars, in order to select a gear, you need to have your foot on the brake. So if the brake light switch ever fails, that signal is missing and you can't select gears. So that's always something to check if you have gear selector problems. Check you've got brake lights. The reluctor rings or ABS rings can corrode and split on the drive shafts on these cars, and that tends to cause dashboard lights to come on, ABS, traction control, even reductions in speed, because it thinks that there's a wheel slip in, or there's a differential in wheel speed between one side and the other. Drive shaft oil seals can also sometimes leak on the gearbox and the differential. They're fairly straightforward to do. Gearbox fluid is fairly straightforward to change on these cars, and whilst it's not a service recommendation, it's a good thing to do. In terms of the rear brakes, the brake shoes can sometimes stick to the drums on cars that aren't used very often or are laid up when they're wet. This can be difficult to release, and the car tends to release with a jolt. This is why I don't leave my vehicle for long periods of time with the handbrake on. Wheel cylinders are nearly always leaking when you perform a brake inspection, but they're cheap to replace. The rearmost section of the brake pipes can also corrode, but you can buy these fairly easily and they can be replaced on their own. Front brakes don't cause too many problems. Just bear in mind that the brake discs are pretty thin from the start, so you tend to need to change the discs with the pads as they go below minimum thickness very quickly. Suspension on these cars is very hard, and they are prone to snapping front coil springs. You can also see how skinny these front wheels are, so the wheels themselves are quite prone to damage from potholes, so it's one to check. Top suspension mountings can also compress over time, and this can cause a knocking from the front. And the anti-roll bar inner bushes can fail, which causes an oinking noise over bumps. Very easy to replace. It's definitely worth being aware that there is only this plastic panel between the front suspension and the rest of the world. So it doesn't take much to crash into something and damage suspension components. So even relatively small speed knocks can damage suspension components, so it's really important to just have a good check. While we're on the subject of this, it's always worth checking behind. If you can, look behind to make sure that these panels haven't pushed in and damaged the cross beams that go across behind here. There's one at the front and one at the back, and they're the first line of defense against knocks and small crashes. Sometimes they can be damaged, but the panels spring back out and you don't know it. Check for any warning lights on the dashboard. You can get problems that need a scanner. Heater motors can pack up. They can go intermittent to start with. If you bash around at the dashboard, they come back on. Relatively easy to change. And inside here for the heater temperature control, there is a rheostat. That can fail inside as well, which makes it very hard to regulate the temperature of the vehicle. As previously explained, the SAM unit, which has all the fuses and the relays, lives under here. It can have issues. Solder joints can deteriorate on those and cause all sorts of electrical issues. And that is exacerbated by any windscreen leak, because if water gets into that, it will really mess it up. The air conditioning system on these cars is quite weak. The condenser lives just in here. I've got a new one on my car, there's a video about that. That can easily be damaged by stones flying through the grille, and that can let out your refrigerant. Under here in the heater box is a small sensor with a couple of wires on it. It's very easy for someone to kick that off because it's well within reach of the left foot on a right-hand drive car, or the passenger if you've got a left-hand drive car. That can be damaged and that takes out the aircon. And of course there's also on the turbo models a chance that the intercooler fan could have seized and that can blow the fuse. I think it's fuse 14 from memory, but double check. And if that blows, then the aircon just does stop working too. It's always good to buy a vehicle with the best interior that you can find, but the good thing about these is that the seats are really easy to remove, and it's always a good idea when buying a new car to take the seats out and give it a really deep clean. Due to the style of the carpets, there isn't a trim that goes across here as there is in many cars, so you find all manner of things under these carpets. Things just get under there. It's always a good idea to get a car with good service history. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't want to work on these vehicles, possibly because they don't understand them. They're not to be feared. They are fairly straightforward, but they are quite niche. As a result, a lot of people take care of their own cars, and I've found that the Smart community to be a particularly friendly one. So if everything else stacks up and the car looks good, it's always a good idea to give it a good road test. As I said earlier, the clutches on these don't last forever, so focus on that initially. Make sure it's not juddering, it's not slipping, and that gear changes are smooth. Also make sure the car drives in a straight line. As I said, the vulnerability of the front suspension components means some of them have had a knock, and if the steering wheel is to one side and it's not straight when you're going in a straight line, or if the car pulls to one side, then those are kind of red flags. The brakes should also be smooth. You might find that there's a little bit more brake travel than you're used to with conventional cars. The brake pedal is odd on these, it comes up out of the floor, a bit like an old Beetle. There shouldn't be any knocks or clunks, but if there are, you could be looking at suspension components, especially at the front. As I mentioned earlier, the anti-roll bar bushes make a very distinctive noise over speed bumps if they need changing, and the suspension top mounts can also knock over bumps too if they need changing. It's probably also worth mentioning that it's quite common on these cars for there to be a really odd smell at the back end when you've been driving it for a while, like a rubbery smell. That's quite normal and a lot of people have mentioned it. I think the rear wheels kick up all sorts of muck and bits of rubber from the tyres onto that exhaust that goes right the way across the back of the car. So it's quite common for that to be the case, so don't be too alarmed at that, providing it's within the realms of acceptability. And also you will get a ticking noise when you switch off as all the components cool down. Quite normal. So I hope I haven't put you off buying one, because they do have their quirks. They are quite unique. People seem to either love them or hate them. And one thing's for sure, people won't want to be behind you. It doesn't seem to matter how fast you're driving one. People want you out of their way, even though you can outrun a lot of cars, especially on the 84 brake horsepower model. They already are quite quick. So I hope this has been useful. I've made a number of videos on many of the issues that I've mentioned in this buyer's guide, so please feel free to subscribe to my channel, have a look through and see if there's a video there for whatever problem you might have. I look forward to seeing you again in another video very soon. Meantime, thank you very much and goodbye.